This was not a task befitting a member of the Kingslands. This thought had crossed Rye's mind more than a few times during the trek from the palatial fortress at Ernholm's heart down to the deepest caverns of the mountain's roots. Given the sheer scale of such an enormous subterranean city, the journey would take the better part of the whole day, and Rye was certain that if he could see the sky, that the stars would be out by the time he reported his findings back to the king. It was a terrible shame, having to abandon a perfectly good breakfast for this. But on the other hand, it had been some time since His Highness had asked much of Rye at all. As fifth spear, he was not so important to be needed at the king's beck and call, and was senior enough to avoid having to attend the most tedious and loathsome tasks the Kingslands members were assigned. Rye understood his role in the Kingslands, understood that he was kept a member of that most esteemed order of servants, more as an honorary than due to prowess. Perhaps once, when he had been younger, he could have ascended to first spear, but his fighting days were nearly spent, and according to some, they had been spent a long while ago. There were plenty of whispers about the palace that Rye was just too long in the tooth to remain in the Kingslands any longer, but that Andronax felt he owed it to the old dimer to keep him around, thanks to his veterancy during the Civil War over 2 decades prior. Rye had served, had sustained no small number of injuries in service to the crown, and he had been there when the last of the rebels were finally rooted out and arrested. Some would say that his service had earned him a place among Andronax's elite. But that was then, and by now he was nearly 50 years old, and far past his prime. Certainly Rye was still a steady hand with a sword and spear, and he could still put many a younger man to shame with sling in hand, but he was not so quick or light-footed as he once was. His beard had gone stark gray, and it had been years since there was any hair left on the crown of his head. Aches and pains assailed him daily, and though he would never admit it, Rye knew all too well that his belly would soon be too wide to squeeze into his cuirass if he continued to lounge about the palace all day. Perhaps this task was a rather well-needed stretch of his old legs after all. A particularly nasty shooting pain through his left knee, a stinging rejoinder from a past injury, reminded him that he really should have put his pride aside and asked King Andronax to allow him to retire some time ago. Let one of the younger Dwero waste their time chasing shadows down in the bowels of the mountain. He had earned a chance at an easy life now that he was past his prime. Had the task he was sent to attend been one a bit more exciting, a bit closer to the glory days of his youth, perhaps Rye would have been more enthusiastic. But a few missing miners was not something he considered worthy of a Kingslands investigation. He had fully intended to foist the trip onto the city's constables, but Andronax had wanted his expertise down in the tunnels, and he was not about to take up lying to his king as a new hobby. Ernholm was as busy as ever, the city as alive as any above-ground settlement could hope to be, and Rye had to struggle to hear his own thoughts through the din of the crowded streets. All around him the walkways crossed over and under one another in the intricate geometric knots that his people loved, a mark of the clever craftsmanship of the dwarven masons who had built this place centuries ago. The chiefest and greatest dwarven city to ever exist, and the first to ever exist at that, Ernholm was the seat of all power to the Dwero people, and it was as grand as one could expect. The entire inside of the mountain had nearly been hollowed out, an enormous cone on the inside housing the capital city of Dwero country, and the beams of unhewn stone that supported the great chamber doubled as the roads and avenues of their fair city. Perched at the center, amidst a central column of unhewn rock, was the palace, where Rye lived in his personal suite of apartments, and the rest of the city spread out from there, from the residential district where he was now, down to the industrial district closer to the feet of the mountain, and far, far below lay the ancient mines where their people had grown rich enough to build this place at all. Gold and silver and precious stones had lain in wait beneath the mountain, and their goblin ancestors had dug greedily before they ended up extinct. Rye wrinkled his nose at the mere thought of the foul people that the Dwero had been born from. It was better not to think about those times in their history, back when they were a black-hearted and a hateful folk, the only flesh to walk the world not born from grace, but from malice. He shuddered and muttered a quick prayer to the One, in thanks that they had been reborn as they were now. The world did not need goblins in it anymore. He stepped politely aside as a young mother and her little ones trailed past him, sparing a warm, grandfatherly smile at one of the pups as he gaped up at the armored warrior in awe. Rai understood that he was not quite the strapping young soldier he once was, but he proudly wore the scars of his service, and his grizzled visage still sparked dreams of honor and glory in the hearts of young Dwaro boys who beheld him outside of the palace. It helped make all of this tedium just a bit more worthwhile to witness the esteem his position afforded him. Rai could not help but continue to smile as he walked, deftly avoiding a group of unsupervised children who were running about singing an old nursery rhyme as they chased one another through the streets. Beware of the nith, they who stalk in the wood, who snatch children up who don't do as they should. For not a young pups who do cause such a din, through the cracks in your timbers the nith will creep in. They'll come up on you as you lay in your bed, and their mantles as white as the hoods on their heads. For vile Iron Hand they'll peel off all your skin, to replace what is missing, they'll bring it to him. And mother and father asleep in their bed won't know until morning their child is dead. So always behave and repent for your sin, and maybe, just maybe, the nith won't slip in. A morbid little rhyme, Rai muttered under his breath, but a timeless one. He could vaguely recall something to the same nature being sung all the way back when he was a child, though the lyrics to this new version were clearly altered to fit modern vernacular. Children would be children, he supposed, and shook his head. It was a funny thing to be reminded of the nith, those proverbial boogeymen of all the known world. It was ancient history by now, and only the Fae could say whether the nith or the Iron Hand had truly marched at Rattenwick's side during the darkest days of the world. If they had ever existed at all, they were long gone by now. His mind shifted back to the task at hand. The missing miners was no doubt a matter of concern, Rai had to admit, and certainly Andronak seemed to think something sinister was at play here. The king had taken counsel from the fairies at the top of the mountains some weeks ago, and with winter on the way, the fairies who dwelt in the winds of the mountain's peak were of the dour and more serious sort. It was the best time of year to seek the wisdom of that fair race, and Rai had no doubt that wisdom is what they had given, but Andronax had been quiet and withdrawn since speaking to them. As a rule, Rai did not care for most fairies he had ever met. They were flighty, irritatingly merry and whimsical under the best circumstances. Rai was a man who valued business first, and liked those who spoke plainly. The Fae, by and large, spoke infuriatingly in riddles, and seemed to take an annoying sort of glee in the trials and tribulations of mortals like himself. Wise though they may be, and benevolent for the most part, but he preferred the company of his fellow Dwaro to the fairies. They were growing rarer and rarer now anyways, many leaving behind the world of the living to flit back to the side of the One. But there were always more, dwelling in the natural places of the world. Waterfalls, rivers, volcanoes, and forests, and the winds of the seasons all carried that beautiful race of formless folk. Light and sound were usually the only signs of them, but Rai had seen one or two of them deign to inhabit a physical body in his youth. The counsel that the wintry fairies had provided to his king on the mountain peak must have been dire indeed for Andronax to suddenly decide that a king's lance should be sent to investigate, and Rai wondered what it was that they had told him. It was above his station to ever presume to ask, but he had no doubt that his cousin Hyde would have some inkling. As Andronax's vizier and right-hand man, Hyde was privy to that sort of thing, and Rai made a note to speak to his cousin about all of this upon his return to the palace. He slowed his pace as the streets grew less and less packed with pedestrians, and he knew he was getting close to the industrial district. At the lower-budget housing between the two districts, it was impossible to block out the ringing of hammers and creaking of machinery as the great forges and workshops churned out works of cleverness and beauty alike. If he was going to be on this trek all day, there was no need to walk so quickly, he reasoned, dabbing at his forehead with the cravat around his neck. It had been a mistake to remain in full dress uniform for this, and he kicked himself for not having the foresight to change into something more comfortable before setting off. Rai leaned heavily on his spear as he went, and shamefacedly wondered how much he looked like an old man tottering on a stick. He decided that he was going to treat himself to a sumptuous dinner when he returned home, as recompense for his spoiled breakfast. Over 30 miners had gone missing, sent down into the yawning earth last night. They would have been hard at work down in the tunnels below the city before Rai had even woken that morning. He prided himself on still rising at dawn to drill with his fellow lances, but down in the mines, time passed differently. There was no sun, no stars, no clocks, and no way to tell whether an hour or a day had gone by down there in the dark. The mines were in operation all the time, always being expanded, always being dug deeper and deeper into the earth in search of riches. Urnholm was the wealthiest city in Dwaro country, perhaps even the wealthiest city in the world, and the mouth of its prosperity always hungered for more. The men who had gone down to the earth should have returned 8 hours after they had left. Now it had been over 13 hours, and no one had seen hide nor hair of them. Rai would have thought that a matter like that would be best dealt with by the mine foreman, but Andronax insisted that any and all irregularities come to him first. Rai didn't like to think any ill of his king, but the thought that Andronax might be acting just a touch paranoid crossed his mind, not for the first time. And so here he found himself, sweltering in the heat as he trekked through the industrial district, always making his way deeper and deeper downwards into the depths of the earth. Missing miners, grim portents from the Fae. To him it seemed purely coincidental, but Andronax had spotted a thread, and like it or not, he was going to have to pursue it until his lord was satisfied that there was no threat. He supposed it was just as well that he was out of the palace for the day. If he recalled correctly, one of the princess consorts would be bearing children any day now, and he did not want to be present when the big day came. Rai had no children of his own, and never planned to, for all his friendliness with the little tykes. His life was one dedicated to service and to war. He had never taken a wife either, choosing to spend his time by himself for the most part, and aside from the occasional flirting with the maids of the palace, he was content to remain single for the remainder of his days. Children were a strange and mystifying concept to him, and it had been such a long time since he had been a child himself that Rai found it difficult to relate with them, or tolerate all the noise and commotion that they brought with them. The palace would be in a complete hullabaloo the moment that the newest member of the royal family was born, and that sort of mess would mean less peace and quiet for him to enjoy. Not to mention that he would be required to attend the christening of the new prince or princess, as well as the presentation to the public, and he had little doubt that there would be a customary celebration to cap off the whole mess. A parade or two, feasts, parties, and dances, and all of it meant staying on duty in his stuffy dress uniform for the better part of a whole week. It was not Rai's idea of a good time. He stopped to take a rest for a short while, wished he had packed a lunch or something to chew on, and settled for a quick smoke instead before he went on. He never left home without his little clay pipe and a bit of tobacco on his person, and Andronax would not mind, he was certain, if he just took a brief respite. The missing miners would not be going anywhere, he reasoned, and took a seat on the edge of one of the walkways, letting his legs dangle over the side leisurely as he fumbled for a match. The streets outside of the great foundries and workshops were all but deserted, the men inside too hard at work to emerge until their labors were finished, and so Rai had a bit of time to himself out here. He lit his pipe, took a good long huff, and wondered if he would be able to get his cuirass back on if he took it off now. Rai discarded the thought, leaned back and blew out a lovely little smoke ring that wavered and broke apart as it drifted through the air between this walkway and the one adjacent. He considered the task at hand and how best to approach it upon his arrival in the mines. Once again the thought came that this was not a job deserving a King's Lance's attention, but nevertheless he intended to do it right, if he was going to do it at all. He would need to rendezvous with the foreman who had sent the miners down below the previous night. The fellow had sent a runner up to the palace that morning, but Rai hadn't had the pleasure of speaking to him personally. He wondered if it would have been wiser to bring the constables with him anyways. More manpower would increase the chances of stumbling across the missing men, whom Rai was certain had just gotten lost in the tunnels. The ordeal would be a little scare for them, but in the end there'd be no harm done so long as he found them and got them back up safely. He decided he'd better just handle this alone. No point in ruining anyone else's morning with this banality. If a few hours went by and he hadn't dealt with the issue on his own, he would return back to the city and fetch a few helpers. Blowing out a couple more smoke rings and wondering how late it would be before he returned home that evening, he sighed and got back to his feet. Time to get moving again. It took the better part of another 2 hours to leave behind the industrial district and reach the entrance to the mines. It was very deep now, beneath the point where the mountain feet met the hills at their base, and another Duero rushed out to meet him as he approached the gatehouse near the mines. "Kingslance, thank the One!" "Aye, 5th Spear, Rye, at your service. Your runner reached us this morning." The other Duero was a short fellow, stout but well built from a lifetime of work beneath the earth. He walked with a noticeable limp, Rye noted, and he wondered if the related injury was what had landed him in the far more comfortable role as an administrator at this particular branch of the mine. "Thank the One!" he repeated again, graciously reaching out to shake Rye's hand. "It's been so long now, and I hadn't heard anything. I wondered if the king had refused to hear us out." Under most circumstances, a few lost workers are not a matter worth bringing before His Majesty. You know this, yes?" Oh, well, certainly, my lord, but this is not a case of lost workers at all." "No?" "The men who have disappeared are experienced, my lord. Good, strong lads with canny heads on their shoulders. Not a one of them is new to working with me or with these shafts. They should have had no trouble at all coming back a long while ago." "A cave-in, maybe? Any chance that they could be trapped down there?" "I sent a search party down to look for them after they didn't return at the end of their shift. When the searchers returned, they said that the entire shaft was completely empty. No sign that my workers had ever even been there." I considered this. This entire situation was growing more and more suspicious. The uncanny nature of the disappearance lending some credence to old wives' tales and worries that lurked in the most childish reaches of his imagination. "You are certain that they ever did go down? No chance that they decided to skip out on you, is there?" The foreman shook his head. "No, my lord, I would bet my life on it. Those Duero were led by one of my finest, Aldrin, and he hasn't missed a day's work in all the time I have known him. He would never allow the men to skip out so long as he was breathing." "Very well. You understand I have to ask. Show me to the mine shaft. I will take a brief look. If nothing is found, then I will need to leave you for a time and return in greater numbers." "Better that I should go with you, if it's all the same to you, my lord. Those tunnels go on for miles and miles below the earth, and without a guide who knows them, you may end up lost yourself." Rye had intended on requesting a guide, but this would do. "Aye, much obliged," he said gruffly, hefting his spear and following the foreman as he moved past the gatehouse and towards the yawning cavern that would lead them into the abyss. The foreman was already carrying a lantern, but Rye snagged one of his own from the rows of posts bearing them that lit the way down into the jaws of the world. "You will not be needed here to manage the gatehouse?" he inquired, watching as the foreman puffed along just ahead of him. "Truthfully, my lord, I should not even be here at this hour. When the nighttime shift reaches its end, I am meant to return home along with all the workers to make way for the morning force. But with this dreadful situation, I didn't dare leave until I had seen to it that the others are safe." Rye could appreciate the integrity of the man. Staying long past his own call of duty to look out for the needs of his workers made him a decent fellow so long as the Kingslance was concerned, and trust came easy to a veteran like Rye. Once one had taken their perfunctory look at a man and made their judgment call on him, one had to be ready to place his life in those hands at a moment's notice. That was just how things had been during wartime, and Rye did not break habits easily. "You do them a good justice by coming with me," he said. "Are you certain you will be well? It will have been some time since you slept, I would think." The foreman let out a short bark of nervous laughter. "I don't believe I could so much as blink until I know what's become of my men. Their families, you see. They entrust me with the safety of their brothers, husbands and sons. If I cannot keep them alive, what can I do?" I glanced up uneasily as they entered the cave, and the lights of the city above them were blotted out by the gullet of rock that they walked along. Duero were made of stern stuff, and living underground was something that they had done for centuries since their birth. But a wide open city with easy access to the mountainside and fresh air and sky was a far cry from the cloying, choking blackness of the world's innards that they were moving into now. Or I would have preferred someplace where he could move around a bit more easily. The tunnel sloped gently down, twisting around in a slow, lazy spiral over itself as it snaked down into the earth. "Where we are now is in the main of Shaft A," the foreman told him over his shoulder. "That's the one that I manage the workers for." "What do you dig for here?" I wondered. "Silver, mostly, and lead for slingers, of course, but silver is more profitable." "You ever run into trouble down there before?" The foreman thought a moment. Sometimes we find little critters down here. Bats, big bugs, snakes, every now and again. Nothing really very dangerous that I can think of. The biggest cause for fear, as far as I can say, would be the earth itself. Rye took a moment to dip a hand into his satchel and run his fingers over the small leaden bullets he carried with him. His slings would be little use to him in these tight quarters if something dangerous did lurk down here, and the same went for his spear as it thumped along beside him. Rye wished he was still allowed to carry a sword with him. It had been a people-pleasing decision that Andronax had made, a way to show the common folk that the nobility would no longer wear weapons meant for killing fellow Duero now that the war was over. The stone walls were jagged around them as they walked, Rye's clanking armor punctuated with the soft footfalls of the foremen just ahead. Their lanterns lit the way well enough, cutting through the thick darkness that surrounded them, but Rye still did not like the tightness of the walls. The passage was nearly 2 meters high and 3 more in width, by his estimate, tall enough for him to walk upright, but he had to angle his long spear sideways to keep it from scraping the ceiling as he went. "We are alone," he observed. "These mines are never empty. Where is everyone?" "You've arrived near to midday, Kingslance. Anyone who isn't still digging down below our feet would have been in the boarding house or the mess. I ordered the shaft of the missing workers to be left completely alone, in case there is some danger down there. Aside from the search party some hours ago, nobody has been down there since the disappearance." It all felt off, Rye thought. Not just the foreman himself, but the circumstances he found himself in. The foreman had been nothing if not helpful and diligent, traits which Rye admired in a man, but it was odd to have not seen another soul on his way in. Come to think of it, as they had passed by the courtyard near the gatehouse, it had been decidedly quiet. The crunch of his own boots and the foreman's on the gravel path had been the only sound. Miners were, at least by reputation, a rowdy bunch when given over to good food and drink, and if any number of men were in the mess, he should have been able to hear them or see shapes moving about through the open windows of the hall. Nobody was moving about in the yard, nor was anyone going to or from this shaft or any of the others. It was completely deserted. Much as Rye liked what he had seen of this mining foreman, there was something wrong about all of this. The task he had been given was not fit for a man of his station. The mines were uncharacteristically deserted, and the only person he had met at all since leaving the city proper had acted just a little bit too likably. Trust came easy, yes, but Rye was not stupid. His hackles were up, but for now nothing had actually happened to cause alarm. He cast a wary look at the foreman as they reached the end of the tunnel, where an enormous wooden platform had been constructed dangling over the lip of a massive chasm. More lanterns were lit, and a safety rail of thick rope looped around the edges to prevent falls. This, Rye guessed, was where the mine opened up properly. Once more he took note of the fact that he could not hear the ringing of picks or shovels down below them. Perhaps the digging was simply being done too far down below to be heard, or perhaps there was no digging happening there at all. "This way," the foreman motioned, and Rye followed him to the edge of the platform, where flight upon flight of rickety-looking steps led down, down, down into the dark. He could guess that the many different subshafts of the mine branched off from here. Wordlessly, he followed the foreman. "So these men did not lose themselves, nor do you believe that anything attacked them?" Rye asked after a short span of silence while they descended the stairs. "I can't say that I know what became of them. I was hoping you could help us figure it out, to be honest. I expect we won't find anything, just the two of us. Like you said afore, we ought to get more men from the constabulary to help out." Rye's eyes narrowed. "I did not mention the constables." "Did you not? I thought it was implied, that's all. Watch your step down here. It can be tricky to see which step is which the further down you go." "I will." Something was wrong. Every instinct in Rye's body was crying out that danger was nearby, that something uncanny and not at all friendly was awaiting him down here in these tunnels beneath the bones of the mountain. Something that nobody had ever been meant to find. The thought crossed his mind that he ought to leave now, report his odd findings to Andronax and seek aid. But he had not actually discovered anything worth telling of yet. Bad feelings were no evidence. He gritted his teeth and kept a tight grip on his spear haft as he followed behind the foreman. "I never did catch your name," he said at length. "Rude of me not to inquire." "Me? Oh, well, it's Aldrin, my lord. Did I not say before?" "You didn't. And wasn't Aldrin the name of one of the men who went missing?" Rye was now completely on guard. This fellow was not at all what he appeared to be. If the first embers of a second rebellion against the crown were beginning to smolder down here at the city's roots, then he would be the first to take the spear to them.
You perhaps misheard me, my lord. The foreman laughed awkwardly. Aldrin is my name. The man leading my workers was named Ilbram. Here we are now. This is the sub-level where the workers disappeared.
Rye took a good look at where they had ended up. It was as black as pitch beyond the light of their lanterns, and the air was frigid cold this deep, where sunlight would never reach. They were standing at the very base of the chasm, the floor uneven and rough-hewn, laid down with duckboards for sure footing as stagnant groundwater sloshed between the granite slabs. There were other tunnels, marked with signposts and lanterns, but still no sign that anyone was down here at all recently. No tools left behind, no stray miners resting or stopping to drink or smoke between hard bouts of tough labor. The mine was as silent as the grave, only the faint dripping of the groundwater providing any break to the silence. Before them yawned the darkest cavern yet, the lantern that should have kept it lit having either run out of oil or been put out by hand. A small wooden signpost nailed into the rock denoted it as Shaft A, Sub-Level A1. Rye shuddered as he beheld the man-made throat that looked ready to swallow him up whole. "Aye then, let's get this over with," he murmured, glancing at Aldrin. "Show me where they should have been last evening."
"Of course. Follow me, my lord," the foreman replied, still as pleasant as ever.
Rye found that his initial liking for the man was beginning to morph into a suspicious resentment. He hefted his spear in one hand, loosened the shortest sling tied around his shoulder, and peremptorily fitted a lead bullet to the pouch. In a pinch, any slinger worth his shots knew that a hearty whack with a good bit of lead on a rope would put anyone on the floor. If Aldrin was a traitor or a budding revolutionary leading Rye into a trap to weaken the King's Lance, he would find that this old spear would not surrender without a fight. Inside they went, Rye stumbling here and there on loose pebbles and clanking in his armor loudly enough that he was certain he would wake the bats. The subshaft was expertly dug, lined with sturdy wooden supports at regular intervals, and Rye could see glitters of silver still unclaimed running in rivulets through the walls as they went along. Clearly this subshaft was still one worth the effort of excavating, though still he found himself perplexed as to how any of that precious silver could be left alone while the tunnel was being dug in the first place. It didn't seem as though the shaft had been tunneled out specifically to follow the vein of ore, but rather for some other purpose. "Good bit of silver still here," he observed. "No one thought to dig that up by now."
"Of course, my lord, every day we're still expanding the shaft, but one must take care not to cause a collapse, and besides which, sub-level A1 isn't here just to dig up silver."
Rye gripped the spear tighter. "I thought you said that was what you were after down here."
"It's what we've gotten, yes, and in spades as well. It isn't what we were digging for."
Rye stumbled again as he listened, caught himself on his spear and looked down at the floor beneath his feet. There had been a subtle shift in the way the floor of the tunnel was composed, a change in the manner in which it had been dug out, and as he raised the lantern back up he could see that there were no more wooden supports lining the passage ahead as it sloped sharply down into the dark. "And what, precisely, were you digging for?" he wondered aloud, suspicion and fearful wonderment boiling together in his belly. His instincts shrieked at him to run away, to abandon this place and make haste back to the palace to warn Andronax of what was awaiting down here. Only he didn't know what it was he was so frightened of. Aldrin, or whoever this strange and threatening dweller was most definitely an enemy, and Rye was wise enough to get when he was being strung along. This was a trap. He was certain of it now, but until he could survey the threat and have some solid idea of what he was facing, it would be cowardice and dereliction of duty to flee now.
"A feeling," Aldrin sighed, his voice wistful. "An instinct. We dreamed about it, you know."
"Speak plainly, man." Rye was now leveling the point of his spear at Aldrin's back. Still the other Dweller walked along and did not turn.
"We heard her voice in our dreams, felt the lady's embrace all around us. And even if we didn't know it was her, we just couldn't help ourselves."
"What lady?" Rye demanded. "What are you babbling about?"
There was a faint light now as the pair of them continued deeper into the tunnel. An eerie sort of luminescence that gathered around them and seemed to shine out from deeper below. Even as he walked, Rye could understand that the passage had changed drastically, and in the light of his lantern he saw how the stone had not been cut by pick or crushed with hammer, nor had the passage been dug down into the deeper reaches of the earth. This passage had been scratched, clawed into a winding, twisting burrow by something not at all Dwero, and it had been dug upwards. A faint sound could be heard, a sort of cooing or gentle singing, as of a mother's lullaby. Rye's hand shook ever so slightly on the spear haft. "You foolish, pathetic creatures," Aldrin sighed just ahead of him. "How soon you forget, little goblin." Rye bristled at the insult. "I have stomached just about all that I can be bothered to from you, boy," he snarled. "By the authority of King Andronax, son of Kelamin, I place you under Aldrin let out a slow, wheezing chuckle. He had stopped just before a bend in the tunnel, behind which the ghostly light was shining brighter than ever before. I felt the coldest stone of fear he had ever felt in his many years drop into his belly. He did not want to go around that corner, did not want to see what was lying in wait down here, what had scratched and clawed and burrowed its way up to meet them as they had dug down, fueled by greed. "Go ahead." Aldrin stepped to the side and motioned for him to walk further. "Continue your search, Kingslance. I reckon you will find who you are seeking, just through here." He did not want to look, tried to will himself to turn and run. Nothing in the war had affected him like this. No storm of sling fire or hurricane of swords and spear tips had turned him back. Rye had weathered the cruelest evils that Dwero or Troll were capable of, all without so much as a flinch. He had seen men tortured until they could not even speak. He had seen a charnel pit filled with the burned corpses of murdered women and children. He had witnessed things that had given many a less stout-hearted man nightmares until the end of his days, and borne all of it with a steadfastness alike to the great warriors of ancient legend. But this was worse than anything he had seen or felt, and he had not even looked around the corner yet. Something was waiting there for him. Something anticipated his arrival. The purring lullaby was louder now, a song sung in a language older than his entire race, sung by a being whose birth had matched the start of all creation. Trembling in his boots, Rye felt his feet move unbidden, and he stiffly made his way forward. Aldrin stood, unmoving, and for the first time it hit Rye that there was no light behind the man's eyes. He stood, arms still flung wide invitingly, lips curled into a grim smile. But he was dead. He had been dead before he had ever met Rye back in the city. "See us," the voice that was Aldrin but not Aldrin hissed out between the gritted teeth of the dead man, a voice that was soft and sibilant now. "Know us, your sires." And Rye looked. The passage flared into a massive chamber, so massive that it was unclear just how big it even was, for it was too dark to see all of it. It spread out below him, a chasm so deep and dark that it must have reached down into the very heart of the world, and looking back up at him were things. Hundreds, no, thousands of eyes peered at him in the dark, thousands of scuttling legs and gnashing jaws and slurping tongues. A horde of little bodies, so many that they could not be counted, were writhing and fighting and digging over and around one another, each one of them impossible to distinguish from its neighbor, so that the entire cavern looked to be flooded in a sea of bodies. Men stood among them. Hundreds of miners, maybe more, stood inside the cavern, strung up like puppets on strings, limbs flung wide, rooted to the spot, unable to move or escape, tools still grasped in filthy, twitching fingers. And now that Rye could see them, it was as if a magic spell had come undone, and all at once the horrific moans of the tortured souls below met his ears, and he realized that they were all of them still living. Every man seemed to turn his eyes to see Rye standing up above them, lantern in hand, spear clattering from nerveless fingers as he beheld this damnation made manifest. Their bodies were wasted, gnawed upon, bellies swollen or splitting as hundreds more of the little creatures incubated within, waiting to worm their way out and join this army of horror. Cries for mercy, cries for loved ones or for death filled the cavern, and yet behind all of it, he could still hear that haunting lullaby. She lay among them. Impossible to describe, impossible for eye to even behold all of her in her terrible splendor. The Great Mother, the mountain of pallid, swollen flesh, the Pale Lady. Memories of wives' tales and stories taught to children came to Rye's mind, and he heard Aldrin laughing just behind him as he stood, frozen in terror. Doom was upon the world, he realized with a deathly sort of calm. Doom had come to all. The Black Sires were returned, and in their greed and folly, his people had dug them back up from their graves. The end was on the horizon. Behind him, Aldrin shuddered violently, convulsed, and Rye forced himself to look over his shoulder, tearing his eyes away from the nightmare he was beholding. The other Duero had tipped his head backwards, his throat bulged, dead eyes popping in his head. A gurgling, choking noise was coming from him, and Rye recalled his dropped spear. Aldrin's body shivered again, and now a long, black tendril snaked forth from his mouth, teeth popping out in its wake as it tore free and languidly fell upon the corpse of the man it had puppeteered. Rye met the eyes of a great black serpent as it raised its flat head and beheld him in its flaming eyes. The chasm stood behind him now, the serpent just before him. He knew what he was facing, and the only thought in his head was that he must escape, must flee and warn the city of what was waiting to surge upwards and devour all of them. If he was quick, perhaps he could skirt around the serpent, run back up the tunnel and try to reach the surface. But old wounds had left Rye less nimble than he had been in his youth. Could he outrun the serpent? And would the hordes of feasting monsters below be sent to chase him down? His heel brushed the spear shaft. He could try to give battle, kill the snake, use his lantern to start a fire, or find some way to destroy this nest of evil that writhed and coiled and incubated down here in the dark. But could he manage that? Could he, a lone Duero, accomplish what the mightiest troll warriors and wisest fae could not? The choice is yours.